Hello, wow. Thank you so much for that intro. So today we're going to be embarking on a little thought experiment about how our ideal version of CSS might look like. But before we get to that, let's go through some background. Now, I started making websites, like a lot of you in the audience, a while ago, like in the late 90s, just a few years after the first CSS spec was rolled out. And as you might know, the web was a very, very different place back then. So the old internet was made for documents. And when you think about the weird, annoying things about CSS, like global scope, in the world of documents, it actually makes a lot of sense. But nowadays, people of the web have changed. Even as soon as 5 years ago, having your own style sheet for your favorite websites on the web was not an unheard of thing. And web development itself has changed. The DOM is no longer static, and I'm pretty sure I spend most of my time troubleshooting NPM and Node instead of writing like actual HTML and CSS. So it's a wild, wild world we live in. So in the last 20 years, we have been molding CSS to fit our needs. In 2006, SaSS was released, and it blew all of our minds. Does anyone remember the first time they heard about SaSS? Because I do, and it was great. Changed my life. Post-CSS meant that our poor fingers didn't have to type out every single browser prefix. And CSS Modules meant the end to global namespaces. We're actually using it at work at the moment to build stateless functional components, and it's a beautiful world. And I'm not even mentioning here the 5 bajillion different namespacing conventions out there, but it's out there. And in this list, you might start to see a pattern. We're increasingly tacking on more and more solutions, more and more conventions, more and more toolkits. But in the midst of all this tooling, we're taking our mental capacity and focusing it on something that's not actually making websites. It's making the act of making websites nice and easy. And in the midst of all this tooling, the core pain point of CSS is still the same. It's hard to write maintainable CSS at scale. Now, what does this mean? It means lack of scope. Global scope might be fine for a weekend project, but as soon as you work with someone else, as soon as you work on a large project with hundreds of views, it becomes really unbearable. It means confusion around which rules apply to which element and which rules don't. How am I supposed to maintain something if I have no idea what changing this piece of CSS will do to some obscure page that no one sees anymore? And of course, the list goes on, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. I'm sure we've all had our own battles with CSS, things like dead code removal from the talk before, just things like working with other people. And by other people, I mean yourself 6 months ago. Just doing something as simple as that is really difficult. But I think that these two distill the core problems of maintainable CSS at scale. And if you look closely at these problems, you can see a common symptom. They both lead to specificity wars. So if we're talking about an optimal styling language, we would do very well to eliminate specificity wars once and for all. And the reason is this. It doesn't matter how much good practice we know. It doesn't matter how diligent we are in the best way to architecture our CSS. As soon as you get into a specificity war, all of that comes off the table, and the importance come out. We've all been there. We've all done that. And since this is such a core problem with CSS that touches on everything from the cascade to selectors to scope to inheritance, solving this should solve a really good chunk of our most fundamental problems with CSS. So now that we have our ideal styling language and we know what it should, well, we don't have it yet, but we know what it should solve, let's go ahead and embark on this thought experiment. What would CSS look like if it were written today? Probably JavaScript. I mean, I kind of want to touch on JavaScript just as an aside, because it's such a massive pillar of our current web development landscape. And as a disclaimer, I have no beef with JavaScript. I am loving CSS Modules. I think it is doing exactly what we need, and it is filling the gaps that the old web left behind. But if we take our current trajectory of web development and take it to its logical conclusion, web development is going to simply be JavaScript development. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, except when it is. You see, the reason the web is so proliferant and successful is because it's accessible. You can access from any device, anywhere. It degrades gracefully if you have JavaScript turned off. If your web browser doesn't understand what CSS is, it's fine, you still get the content. And this accessibility is made possible because we separate content, style, and logic. So while JavaScript is really awesome for now, we have to keep in mind and be careful about which direction we're heading in the future. And always bear in mind that accessibility is compulsory for the web, not just a nice to have. So with my JavaScript rant done, we can go on to looking at the ideal styling language. I'm going to break this up into what I see as three core culprits to specificity wars. The first being the cascade. So what does our ideal cascade look like? Well, first of all, who here actually knows what the cascade is? I know, like, really weird question to ask at a CSS conference, but the many web developers that I've met, including myself, have confused the cascade with the specificity algorithm, with inheritance, and I thought that for the longest time too. But it's neither of those, and what it actually is how the browser decides which rules take precedent depending on where they come from. So here is the order. So when your browser is passing through your HTML and your DOM, it takes an element and it filters out all the rules that don't apply and is left with all the rules that apply to the element that it's looking at right now. Then it performs the cascade algorithm, and it orders all these rules based on where they come from. So the lowest precedent here is the user agent style sheets, which is your browser style sheets, essentially. And then the next one are the user style sheets. So if you want to get creative, if you want to put your own style sheets in your browser, that's where it sits in the cascade. The one above is the author style sheets. This is where your CSS as a web developer lies. And in between that is CSS animations, which sits there, in case you were wondering. It doesn't cascade. And after that are the important declarations for author and user, but flipped around the other way. Now, this is really important because it explains why if someone else has used an important declaration, you can't just make a more specific selector, because the cascade algorithm happens before the specificity algorithm. So it doesn't matter how specific you make it. If someone else has got an important somewhere, it's going to override your thing. So this is the thing. A lot of web developers, and I'm betting on most web developers, not knowing what exactly the cascade is. And we fear what we don't know. We're afraid of the cascade. And this confusion will cause the classic important declarations coming up everywhere and ruining our lives. So I had a long, deep think about how the cascade could be better. And you know what? The cascade is actually really good. We need a way to resolve conflicting rules coming from different origins. And when we think about it, I think we all have a really good idea of where the problem is. It's those important declarations. So let's just remove it. It's our thought experiment. We can do what we want. So look at that. Beautiful. Brand new world. But this causes another issue, which is that in a world without importance, suddenly we have to write good selectors. We can't just import stuff away. So let's look at the ideal selector. Now, what do we want? We want separation of concerns. We don't want a selector that basically regurgitates the DOM structure, but we also don't want a selector we don't want to use so many classes in our markup that we're regurgitating style information in our markup. We want reusability. We don't want to spend all our day copy-pasting, fair enough, but also we don't want the user to download 14 different copies of the same border radius decoration. I've been on GPRS internet. It sucks. You don't want that. And we want efficiency. We want to be able to target only the elements that we want as fast and as unambiguously as we can. So as an example, let's look at BEM versus atomic CSS. So BEM is basically just a namespacing convention where your components define your classes. Declarations inside that component aren't reused elsewhere, which is nice because it keeps your code nice and tight and encapsulated. Atomic, on the other hand, is way on the other end of the spectrum. The philosophy is that classes should be general purpose. They should be reused. They should define common rule sets, and you should be able to apply them to whatever element, whenever. And you can use them over and over again. Atomic CSS is really awesome for lightning-fast prototyping. And I know that there's many in the web development community that think this is weird. I used to think it was super weird, but I highly recommend giving it a go, trying it out, because it really is a great time. Where it fails is it fails to separate content and style. When you have so many classes being reused, you're essentially putting style information in your markup, and that's a problem. You're also repeating yourself a lot because you're calling, 10, 20 different styles in the same element. On the other hand, BEM doesn't have that. There's no styling in the markup, you don't repeat classes. But when you look at the CSS, there's a lot of heavy repetition because you can't reuse the code across components. In many cases, you also see a lot of DOM information encoded in the CSS, which is, again, bad. So we seem to have reached an impasse with our ideal selector. We can't have reusability and separations at the same time. Or can we? This is where I want to take some inspiration from SaSS. Many of you will recognize the syntax. You define a function for a bit of code that you want to reuse over and over again, and you just call it to reuse that piece of code. Awesome. It saves repetition and development, but what happens when we put it in native CSS? It becomes incredibly powerful. So here I'm defining two rule sets that I want to reuse over and over again that are related. And at the bottom, I'm calling those rule sets on some kind of selector, very simple selector. Notice here that I'm not making many classes to be reused. I'm just making one class, so there's going to be no styling in the markup. But at the same time, I can reuse as much code as I want, natively. And in fact, come at me efficiency. I'm free to use the ID selector. What? Remember how we never use IDs because they're by definition one-time use things? Well, not anymore. We can be as explicit and as efficient as we want and still be able to reuse blocks of code. No styling and markup? Check. Highly reusable code? Check. Letting our hair down and using some IDs? Check. Moving right along. So what would our ideal scope look like? Well, as it turns out, scoping in CSS is looking to be pretty straightforward. The upcoming CSS4 spec introduces a scope shooter class in which you can set your own local scope. Very exciting. And to protect your scope from inheriting random other things that other people might have made, you can use all initial to reset every CSS property to their browser defaults. And if that's super hardcore for you, you can also reset specific properties to their initial defaults. The real problem isn't so much the scope as it is working in a hostile environment. And when I say hostile environment, I mean that one client that you took on that needed you to just customize a WordPress theme that was already there, and you weren't allowed to touch the markup, you weren't allowed to touch their CSS, you maybe even just had a teeny wee custom CSS box in which to put your code in. I'm sure we've all been there. So this is a tricky case, because it doesn't matter how good we are. No amount of well-defined scope or really beautifully crafted selectors will stop someone else from directly targeting the element that you work on. So what do? Remember this guy? And our beautiful, simple cascade? What if we just did this? And what if a framework CSS sits here? What if your third-party CSS sits here? And what if your CSS sits here? Interesting. And I know what some of you might be thinking already, looking at this. You're thinking this could probably very easily turn into this. But there's a quick fix for that. We can do that by directly setting the parent that it overrides. So you can never declare your code to be the most important code. You can only say how important your code is relative to the code that's already there. So someone else can always come in and overwrite your CSS if they want to. So yeah, it's not perfect. It can totally be abused, but at least it works. When you slap on an important to one of your declarations, you're not guaranteed that it's going to work, especially if you're in a hostile environment where everyone else is using important declarations. But the thing is, I'm not too worried about the specifics of how this idea might work, because the important part is that it encourages developers to actually interact with the cascade, something that we've never really done before. And when we interact with the cascade, we therefore educate ourselves about the cascade. We get rid of the fear around the unknown. Now you know exactly where in the cascade you sit and why. So what does this all mean for us right now in the real world? The cascade is a powerful thing, and everyone is ignoring it. And maybe we should not ignore it. CSS4 spec is really exciting. We're getting variables, we're getting scope, and the cool thing is a lot of it has already been implemented in Firefox and Chrome, so go ahead, play with it, have fun. As long as you don't need to support IE or Etch, you're sweet. Classic web development. SAS 3.1 now supports first-class functions, which is also really exciting, because I'm really intrigued what CSS might look like as a fully fledged functional programming language. We're not quite there yet, but there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, as you probably heard from the previous talks. So yeah, play around, get involved. The whole BEM versus atomic schools of thought, that's like tabs and spaces, pros and cons. Try both of them out. Don't just go with one blindedly. And really importantly, we need to keep the separation of content, style, and logic. And what we need to do that is to have good interfacing between those. Kudos to Barak's talk before. That blew my mind. That was awesome. So that Houdini API has got me really excited about the future. But the main thing that I learned while going on this long journey of thought experiments and wild ideas and throwing random shit at the wall, is that CSS is not dead. When I started this, I was thinking, oh, there's so many massive problems in CSS. This must mean that it needs massive change. And I was wrong. A lot of the strange things that CSS does is based in good decisions and consideration for wider context than just web development. So maybe it's time to reignite our CSS love. Maybe after our struggle of over-tooling and band-aiding, we can appreciate CSS for what it is and what it does for us. And then we can get involved. We can make sure it keeps working for us and for the future of web development. Cool. Thanks, everyone.